Hello and welcome to this How to Play AtomsPast video. I am Duckfang, the developer of AtomsPast, and I'm excited to show you the basics of the game in this How to Play series. In this video, I'll be showing you how the game uses time as a resource and the basics of combat. For this example, I have a Space Marine from Warhammer 40k going up against some Chaos Cultists from that same universe. The AtomsPast program lets you create rules for any model in your collection and play them your way. And I love Warhammer, and I have a lot of models from their universes. Let's quickly look over the stats of the models for this video and explain how they work in AtomsPast. Then we will set up a scenario with these models and show the basics of combat. Every model in AtomsPast has these basic stats. Durability, which represents how difficult a model is to remove from the battlefield. You could consider it a combination of health, morale, and toughness. Move is the distance your model can move on the battlefield in inches. Melee ability represents the effectiveness of the model in melee combat and is the number for melee attack actions that we try and roll under for damaging another model. Melee range is the distance in inches the model can perform melee attack actions from its base. Ranged ability represents the effectiveness of the model in ranged combat and is the number for ranged attack actions that we try and roll under to damage another model. Ranged range is the distance in inches the model can perform ranged attack actions from its base. Point cost. In the AtomsPast program, you create these rules for yourself, and the program automatically calculates the cost so that you can play any model you want the way that you want to. Here's a look at the stats of the cultists. And here is a look at the stats for the Space Marine in the model creation section of the program. Now that we've reviewed the stats, let's set up our scenario and learn about activation timers and battlefield actions. Every action in AtomsPast costs a certain amount of time, represented in the game as activation timers. At the start of each player's turn, to represent time moving forward, each activation timer is downticked by 1. When a model has no more activation timers on it, it can perform a battlefield action. In our example scenario, 2 cultists will start with activation timers of 3, 2 of them with activation timers of 2, and 1 cultist with an activation timer of 1. The Space Marine will start with no activation timers. Before we continue, let's review what actions each model can perform. Each model in AtomsPast has access to these basic battlefield actions. Move. The model can move up to its move stat in inches. This has an activation time of 2. Run. The model can move up to 1.5 times its move stat in inches. This has an activation timer of 3. Attack action. The model can perform either a melee or ranged attack action. This has an activation time of 3. Charge. The model performs a run action and then a melee attack action. This has an activation time of 4. We are going to jump into this scenario on the Space Marine's turn. Let's look at each option for our Space Marine. They could move, in which we would then add an activation timer of 2 to the model. They could run to a more advantageous position, which would cost 3. They cannot perform a melee attack because no enemy model is within melee range, but they could perform a ranged attack action, which would cost 3. For our learning scenario, we are going to have him perform a ranged attack action against the nearest cultist for an activation time of 3. I'll be showing how to make attack rolls later in the video. For our purposes, we are going to assume he does enough damage to remove the cultist from the battlefield. Now let's start the cultist's turn. At the start of the turn, the cultists downtick or have their activation timer reduced by 1 to represent time passing. We now have 1 cultist with 1 activation timer, 2 that have an activation timer of 2, and 1 cultist who can perform a battlefield action. The one cultist who can act is going to perform a move action to get closer to the Space Marine, which costs activation time 2. It is now the Space Marine's turn. They don't have much to do in our small scenario, just to downtick their model and pass the turn. In the next video, I will show you how the other resource in AtomsPast, Power, which lets you manipulate activation timers and use powerful abilities and spells. But for our scenario, let's move to the cultist's turn. The cultists downtick their activation timers, and this cultist can perform a battlefield action. They are going to choose to do a ranged attack action against the Space Marine. This time, we're going to review how we perform attacks in AtomsPast and roll the dice to see the result. When attacking in AtomsPast, the amount you roll under your ability stat is the amount of damage an attack does, and the amount of dice you roll scales on that same ability stat. The scaling happens on a base 6 system, which adds another d6 dice to the roll per 6 ability. Ability 6 and under roll 1 dice. Ability 12 and under roll 2 dice. Ability 18 and under roll 3 dice, etc. This scaling system gives higher potential and likelihood to do damage with the higher ability a model has. Let's try it with the cultist range attack, and later in the video see the much more powerful attacks of the Space Marine. Our cultists have a ranged ability of 6, so we will roll 1 dice and see how much we roll under their ranged ability for damage. We rolled a 4, resulting in 2 damage against the Space Marine. That action cost the cultist activation time 3, and we have no more eligible models, so we will pass the turn. In our small scenario, our Space Marine will downtick to 1 activation timer, and then need to pass the turn. Feels a bit boring in this small example, but just as a note, once we include power, spells, and keywords, the Marine will most likely have more to do. But for our example, he downticks and passes the turn. In the final 2 turns of this example how to play video, the cultist will downtick, and we have 3 models that can activate. 2 of them will perform ranged attack actions against the Marine. Let's roll for those now. One cultist rolls a 2, which when subtracted from their ranged ability does 4 damage, and the other cultist rolls a 5, which does 1 damage. Let's track their activation timers, and then the last cultist will perform a move towards the Marine, which costs 2 activation timers, and we will pass the turn. Our Space Marine will downtick, removing its last activation timer. Angry at being shot at, we are going to have him perform a charge action against the nearest cultist. To perform a charge, they will move their run distance, which is 1.5 times their move, and then perform a melee attack action against the cultist. Our Space Marine has a high melee ability of 23. So they will roll 4 d6 dice to see the effectiveness of their melee attack. We roll a total of 10, which when subtracted from the Marine's melee ability of 23, does 13 damage. The cultist only has 8 durability, so they are slain and removed from the battlefield. And with that attack, we will end this first how to play video. We learned about activation timers and how time is a resource in AtomsPast. We learned about the different battlefield actions models can perform, and we saw the basics of combat in action. I hope you enjoyed this video, and will tune in for the next video. We will be covering the other main resource of AtomsPast, Power, and we will learn about spells and how they work. Hope to see you next time, and please check out AtomsPast on Steam. Thank you for tuning in.